Okay, so this morning we're going to continue with our conversation about Hinduism. Um, I'm going to try to fly through as much of this as possible so that really, and possibly Thursday, most likely, we won't meet for Zoom because I have a Gen Ed committee that I have to um, be on, and it meets at the same time we do. So I'll do two things. I'll still upload, because that would be our second day of Buddhism. And particularly because you're going to write your first paper on Buddhism, you need the information. So I'll upload the notes like I did from yesterday's lecture to Canvas, and I'll also just do a pre-record of the lecture, and then you can watch it. So you'll still get, but we most likely at this point won't meet on Thursday morning, just because I suspect I'll be at this Gen Ed committee meeting. All right, all right. So we left off yesterday talking about the sort of early stages of Hinduism. And today we're sort of going to do the 30,000 feet look from most of the rest of Hinduism, except for sort of modern day. So this is going to be sort of Hinduism, everything else in 50 odd minutes. So we'll see how that works. And the notes I upload for this lecture will probably include more than I say on today's lecture, just so it can fill in some of the blanks. Anyway, as we were talking about yesterday, the Indo-Europeans, they began to become firmly rooted and established in northern India. And the Brahmanaic ideology became central to the social and political life there. And it was concerned with ritual status and duties of the king, maintaining social order and the regulation of individual behavior in accordance with the sort of all-encompassing ideology of duty. And we'll talk more about that duty in a bit. And righteousness, which duty and righteousness are called dharma. And many of you might have heard the term dharma, and you probably also have heard the term karma. We're going to talk about both of those today in more detail. And dharmic ideology related to ritual and moral behavior, and define good conduct according to such factors as one's class, which is varna, in one's stage in life, which is ashrama, and it operated simultaneously on several levels. So it was in the transcendental level. It was also, which means sort of the eternal, the everyday, and it was also functioning on the individual and personal level. And so neglecting dharma was believed to lead to undesirable social as well as personal consequences. All right. So that's just the sort of sketch of where we're going to go today, and you'll see how this sort of plays out. So the Veda period came to an end. And it really came to an end because of the complexity of the Vedic rituals. And this moved to a second division in the Veda, which was known as the Brahmanas. And this literature was really written between 800 and 600 BCE. And they offered commentary on the Vedic ritual. Including sort of philosophical remarks, a glossary on important words and numbers, and folk tales illustrating religious principles. And the Brahmanas were significantly interested in the problem of human mortality, so the reoccurrent death, and also the divine power of the Brahman, Um, and the Brahman was thought to be inherent in the Vedic hymns and rituals. And so there's four things that are central to the theology here. And that was part of the karma, samsara, and moksha doctrine. And these four things are: all beings are reincarnated into the world. That's samsara, over and over again. So this is the notion of reincarnation that Hinduism has, and also Buddhism picked up on this same notion. The results of action, which is your karma, and that was reaped in future lives. And this process of endless rebirths is characterized by suffering, which is called dukkha. And so suffering becomes essential in this whole process. Every time you're reborn, you have the potential to suffer. And then liberation, which is moksha. And that was liberation from the suffering, and it was gained through spiritual knowledge. And so the same sort of concept that we'll look at in Buddhism about enlightenment falls in this sort of idea about moksha too. As you gain spiritual wisdom or knowledge, you eventually could be released from suffering, and that was seen as salvation. And the term, we should remember that the letters that are in Brahm make up the four separate words in Hinduism. So the Brahmin is used for the Hindu priest, and also the priestly class in the caste system. The Brahma refers to the creator God. The Brahman refers to the sacred or ultimate reality in Hinduism, and the Brahmanas are the early manuals that the priest used to in their Vedic rituals. And so this Brahma, this term, is essential to the overall understanding of the system that we're about to look at. The Veda had two other divisions. So we got the Brahmanas, and then there were finally two other divisions: the wilderness texts and the Upanishads. And the Upanishads are known as the end of the Veda. And this brought the Veda scriptures to a close, if you will, and the soul of the Brahman was here. And so central to the discussion of the Upanishads is the relationship between the Atma, which is the soul of the individual, and the nature of reality, which is the Brahman. So all of us in Hinduism have what we call an Atma. That's our individual soul, and that relates to the Brahman, the universal soul, if you will, or the universal reality. And when the Brahmins practice their sort of sacrificial rituals, they experience Brahman, the universal reality, and they bring their Atma into connection. And so you have this merging of one's individual soul with the universal reality. Everybody with me so far?
Yeah.
Okay. I know it's a lot, and but all right. So therefore, the Brahman is the world soul, if you will, the world Atma. And humans contain a tiny speck of that, and that's our personal Atma. And so the purpose really of Hinduism in the sort of largest cosmic scale is for our individual Atma to reunite with the Brahman, with the universal soul. And so the way that happens is through moksha, through release or liberation. But what happens for most human beings prior to that is the process of reincarnation. So at death, a person's atma re-enters the cycle of life through rebirth into another body. And here, when I say another body, that isn't exclusive of just human bodies. Here, it's living creatures, and it can be inanimate objects. And so a body could be a raindrop, it could be an insect, it could be a tree, it could be a dog, or it could be a human being. And therefore, when the consequences would be either positive or negative, depending on your moral intent. And so when you live your life, there are moral positive consequences and moral negative consequences. And they may not necessarily materialize in this life. So someone could be a bad person and still gain material wealth, okay? But a person has to fulfill their dhamma, their life's duty. And if they don't fulfill their life's duty, that's their ultimate responsibility. And if they don't fulfill their life's duty, in their cycle of rebirth, that karmic tally, so the karma that they've gained, will determine what body they're born into in the next cycle of rebirth. So their soul will be transported from their body that they're currently in when they die, and it will be moved into a new body. And so theoretically, you would imagine that, you would try to move to a higher being, if you will. And that seems to be the logical sort of conclusion that one might draw. But you'll see that that isn't even necessarily what you should be looking for. Now, it's true if you haven't fulfilled your duty, you're going to be born into something less. So you could go from being a human being to an insect or a raindrop. And then say you go to a raindrop has some dharmic responsibility or duty. And if the raindrop successfully completes that duty, they're going to be released from that. Does that make sense to folks?
Yeah.
Okay. So as I mentioned, you would logically sort of conclude that you want to keep being born to a higher level and a higher level. So if you're, the lowest level in the caste system, you would imagine you would want to be born into the next level. But the Upanishads encourages beings to avoid rebirth. And the reason is that rebirth leads to re-death, and so on and so forth, which is this cycle of samsara. And samsara is the stream of existence, if you will. That's what the term means in Sanskrit. And so if you're caught into that cycle, eventually you're not going to be able to fulfill your dharma. And you will continue to, and you'll be born into a lower being. So the truth of the matter is you want to achieve release or moksha. So your purpose in life, if you will, is to fill your dharmic duty and gain that spiritual knowledge so you can actually find release from this cycle of samsara. And that release is called moksha. And so you actually want to live a life without accumulating karma. Now, most of us in sort of general conversation in the world, we talk about good karma and bad karma. And most people will say, well, I want good karma to take place and I don't want to have bad karma. and in the sort of way that we might talk about it, that's true. We want to accumulate good karma. But in Hindu religion, you don't actually want to accumulate any karma, because every time you're in the process of accumulating karma, you're in the process of moving towards rebirth and re-death. Um, and so, therefore, you actually want to live a life that is devoid or void, if you will, of desire. This is why asceticism became really important in certain elements of Hinduism, because ascetics try to live a life without any moral desire or inclination, and therefore they try to actually do things without intention. And so therefore you don't collect any type of karma whatsoever, and your actions, even eating or any natural bodily function or whatever, is done purely at a level to sustain yourself, but without gaining any sort of positive or negative karma. I know that's sort of difficult to understand, but if you can achieve doing these things without accumulating karma, you'll reach the level of Brahman. And then at the level of Brahman, you'll experience this spiritual enlightenment, which will lead to release. Um, and so many of you have probably heard the name Mahatma Gandhi. This is what Gandhi, who became a Hindu ascetic, was trying to live his eventual life. He was trying to achieve living without desire. And so that anything he did was morally neutral, if you will. It didn't have positive or negative effect, so he could achieve moksha and release from that system. All right. Everybody still with me? Give me thumbs up, nod your head, something.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Now we're going to look at this sort of notion of many gods and one God, because Hinduism has been divided historically. Um, there are Hindus that are sort of monistic, meaning that they believe in a unified sort of divine reality, if you will. And there are theistic Hindus who believe in a more than one God. And then there are even pantheistic Hindus that believe the physical universe is joined to a god or gods. And so we're going to look at these three categories in Hinduism, because I think it's, most people see Hindus as believing in a multiplicity of gods, but that isn't the only type of Hinduism that exists. And so the Vedic literatures were theistic in their writing, and the Vedic literatures talked about more than one god, okay? The Upanishads, in contrast to the early Vedic literature, understood ultimate reality as monistic, meaning that there was just there was a one universal reality, if you will. And this was put forward by, there was a doctrine of non-dualism. And that doctrine of non-dualism was developed in the Upanishads. And the person that wrote it, Shankara, declared that the only eternal being is real. The diverse phenomenal world is an illusion. So his notion was that it's a non-dualistic view of the world. Only the eternal being is real. And so actually everything is part of that eternal being. And he called the diverse phenomenal world Maya. Um, and so even the notion of a personal God is part of Maya. So you can see that in the early Vedic literatures, people had the notion of personal gods, and he made this belief that that was even Maya, that that was an illusion and it was not real. The liberation for him comes from realizing oneness with the absolute, which is defined as being, consciousness, or bliss. And so the ultimate goal in the Upanishads was for us to realize our oneness with the ultimate reality, if you will. And so there's no separation, there's no dualism. And once you make that recognition, you become unified in that and you experience bliss or consciousness at the highest level, if you will. Um, Theism, which is what the Vedic sort of literature talked about, is the belief that there is more than one God. In the case of Hinduism, there is sort of a pantheon of distinct deities, and the gods are distinct and separate beings. Um, and so that's typically how most people see Hinduism, is from that pantheon of gods. Um, and the Veda, therefore, provided Hinduism with two distinct visions of reality, ultimate reality. Sort of the earlier theism and the collections where deities were honored and praised, and then the monism of the Upanishads. And so in modern day Hinduism, you can be a theist or a monist, and you'll still be Hindu. And again, this gets back to what I was saying yesterday about there being a diversity of belief. Um, in Judaism, for example, or Islam or Christianity, you can't have people that believe in a singular God and a multiplicity of gods and claim that they're Jewish, Christian, or Muslim. That just doesn't work, you know. But in Hinduism, you can have that. And furthermore, you can even have the notion of pantheism, which is the belief that the physical universe is joined to a god or gods, and that the god or gods are greater than the material universe. So, and so there is a type of Hinduism that supports that belief. And so again, this is even a third sort of understanding of gods. Now, this is part of the reason why most Westerners and folks that don't practice Hinduism find the concepts in Hinduism to be rather difficult to grasp, and particularly how someone, you know, three people can all claim to be Hindus, and one's a theist, one's a monist, and one is a pantheist. All right. The next writings I want to talk about were the Dhamma Sutras. And the Dhamma Sutras relate to duties. And this becomes important in the Dharmic sort of part of that salvation model that I was talking about. But it also becomes important in the caste system, which we're going to look at shortly, because the Dharma Sutras were a compendium of laws. And they stipulate the duties, laws, and regulations binding all categories of Hindus. And so the caste, the varna, the stage of life, the ashrama, or your gender. And this became really important as Hinduism developed, particularly in India. Now, we know that today the caste system is illegal in India, but there's still a pervasiveness of the Dharma Sutras because the caste system was a multi-century sort of system in Hinduism that not only connected to their religious life, but also their daily life and their political life and their work life. So the Dharma Sutras, even though the caste system is no longer legal in India, and therefore is not technically part of Hinduism anymore, the Dharma Sutras still play an immense role because duty is still an important part of that whole sort of dharmic salvation system. All right. Um, one of the writings that many of you have probably heard of is the Bhagavad Gita. And the Bhagavad Gita is part of a larger set of writings that appeared in Hinduism. And I'm not going to talk about those larger set of writings, but I do want to talk about the Bhagavad Gita. And the Bhagavad Gita means the song of the Lord. And even though it's a small part of one of these larger writings, it's become hugely influential in Hinduism. And in fact, across the world, many people have copies of the Bhagavad Gita. Lots of Westerners in Europe and the United States have read portions of the Bhagavad Gita. And so you can buy it, on Amazon and local bookstores and so forth. And so it's really acquired its sort of own independence from the larger text that it's in. And the Bhagavad Gita is a discourse between Krishna, which is Krishna is an avatar, an incarnation of the god Vishnu. And Vishnu is one of the central gods of Hinduism, and Krishna is an avatar of Vishnu. And it's a dialogue between Krishna and his devotee, the prince Arjuna. And Arjuna is the greatest warrior in this larger narrative that the Bhagavad Gita comes from. And their dialogue really is about salvation, okay? And so the Bhagavad Gita is sort of an ironic scripture. And it says that all ways to salvation are equally valid. The way of enlightenment, the way of altruistic righteousness, action and progression through the caste hierarchy, the way of meditation, and the way of devotion are all equal. But the Bhagavad Gita argues that devotion is still the highest of all paths. And this was the first time in Hinduism that a devotee is greatly loved by God, if you will. The reason I lift this up is because this is part of the reason why the Bhagavad Gita has become so popular, because of this notion that all sort of ways to salvation are equally valid, even if the devotional way is revered the most. This is part of the reason why Westerners like the Bhagavad Gita, because it's egalitarian in its nature. It's also why it's become popular in modern day Hinduism, because it sort of levels the playing field, if you will, particularly in the caste system, and it makes that dharmic sort of duty responsibility less central. And so that became important for folks. All right. Having said that, we're going to look at the caste system a little bit now, and that will be sort of the close of today's session. I'll open it up for questions at the end of this. But the caste system, every Hindu is born into the caste system of his or her parents. And the division of a society into groups reflecting and defining the division of labor. So not only is the caste system about the individual lot you have in life or your caste or station in life, it also has to do with labor division as well. And so the nature of one's labor or occupation is determined by the level of one's purity. Now, this is really important, because purity has much to do with being able to reconnect your Atma back to the universal Atma, or the soul of the universe. And you have to be more pure in order to do that. And so the higher you are in the caste system, theoretically, the more pure your soul is. And also ritual worship, scholarship, and sacred texts are seen as the purest pursuits, and therefore they're reserved for the highest level, which is the Brahmins. And so one of the things you can see here is the priestly class is considered to be the most pure class. And they get to do all the functions that are connected with the most important things: ritual, worship, the reading of the sacred texts, and so forth. At the opposite end of that hierarchy, if you will, are the Dalits, which are commonly called the untouchables. And they are, by virtue, sort of impure. And their occupations are connected to impure things: scavenging, tanning of leather, and so forth. And part of the reason is those occupations pollute the body. And by virtue, the reason an untouchable is called an untouchable is when they're in society, if one were to touch them, you would become impure as well. And so you can see that the Dalits, for most of India and the caste system, were excluded from social interaction. They were excluded from much of society. Um, and between those two extremes is where you find most people living. Um, and so in traditional Indian village society, the caste determined most aspects of your life: where one lived, uh, who one could legitimately interact with, who one could share food with, who you could marry. And as a result, social mobility for those in the lowest caste was very restricted, because imagine if you're only allowed to interact and live with and connect with people that are in your caste, you're never going to move up in society. And so one of the things that happened over time was people got fixed into an economic status, not just a sort of religious and political status. They got fixed into an economic status. And it was only through the dismantling of the caste system, and also the transformation of Indian society, sort of with business people becoming multimillionaires and sometimes billionaires, that this really began to break down. But the traditional system falls like this. And so there are four groups in the Varna caste system, because the untouchables, while they're in the hierarchy, were not part of the actual caste system. And so the Brahmins, or the priest, um, were the highest, and they emanated from Brahma's mouth. And so Brahmins actually came out of God's mouth, if you will. The next thing was the warrior or noble class, and they come from Brahma's arms. So if you imagine, as you're thinking about this Brahma, the god, uh, the body, and the Brahmins come out of the mouth, the warriors and nobles come from Brahma's arms, and then we have the commoners, which really are what we would call today business people, and they came from Brahma's thighs. And then you had the Sudras, which were the servants, and they came from Brahma's feet. Now, you notice here who's left out: the untouchables. They don't come from anywhere. So they literally originated, if you will, in this sort of cosmic scheme out of the badness of the universe, what was left over. That's where the untouchables came from. Um, and so what happens is, if you think about this, and we go back to what I was talking about with the cycle of salvation there. Uh, the Brahmins being at the head, really, the mouth, coming from the mouth and the top of the system, have a much, quote unquote, easier path to salvation. They're already closer to spiritual enlightenment, and they're already closer to fulfilling their dharmic duty. Um, and of course, as you go down through the system, you're further away from that, and you're further away from enlightenment and so forth. And so you can also see why the Bhagavad Gita became so popular, because it was the first sort of notion where there might be a different sort of way to achieve salvation than the purely mechanistic way that originally existed. All right, I'm going to stop there. I'm going to open it up for questions. Hopefully you're all still awake. So go ahead, ask away.
I had a question about the journals.
Yes.
Is there like a certain like word count or length that we have to do? I wrote like a little, maybe like a quarter page
That's
paragraph.
fine.
Okay.
You're going to find some days, if we had been on our journey in Australia, for example, obviously you'd have much more experiences. You'd have food and, visiting places and whatnot. Now, because you're doing sort of a virtual daily journal, you might find that today you write yesterday you wrote a quarter page, 4 or 5 sentences. Today's might be 7 or 8, and as we go along and there's more opportunities to look at different things, you might comment on a couple of things, but there's no expectation of a certain length. And really it's based on sort of what you are seeing and experiencing and how you feel about that. So, even if we were in Australia, you might have a day that you just don't write that much, and another day you write a lot. So there isn't any word count I'm looking for.
Okay.
Other questions?
No, I have pretty much everything written down in notes here.
Okay. Alec, you okay there?
Yep, all good.
All right. Josh, you okay?
Yep, all good.
All right. John, you all right there?
I'm good.
All right, then we will call it a wrap. I'll see you all tomorrow. Thanks for hanging in there. Well, Danny, I'll see you later.
Yeah, you will.
But thanks for hanging in, everybody.
Thank you. See you in a bit.